Hello, I'm David Kerans for Radio VR in Washington, speaking now with Paul Craig Roberts, chairman of the Institute for Political Economy, former Assistant Secretary of the US Treasury, who's just published an article called Washington is Humanity's Worst Enemy, outlining some of the contradictions or divergences from common sense or commonly portrait, say, of the United States and the way the country actually operates and how executive power has gotten out of control. And additionally, how that's threatening the world right now with all kinds of catastrophe in Ukraine. Dr. Roberts, maybe you can give us a few of your theses, and I'll kick off for readers with your opening line. How does Washington get away with the claim that the country it rules is a democracy and has freedom? This absurd claim ranks as one of the most substantiated claims in history. Why don't I let you orient readers and listeners further?
All right. Well, it's amazing they can get away with it because what we have here is an oligarchy ruled by a few very powerful, moneyed private interest groups, such as Wall Street, the military security complex, agribusiness, the mining, energy, and timber business, and, of course, the Israel lobby. And all the legislation that Congress writes and the president signs comes either from these interest groups or from the federal security agencies. And so there's not any semblance of a democracy. In fact, what we have is all the indications of tyranny. For example, we have what is called indefinite detention of citizens without due process of law, so that people on mere suspicion can be picked up and incarcerated without ever presenting any evidence to a court. We also now have execution of citizens based on suspicion alone without due process, no evidence, so that citizens who are thought to be in some way connected to terrorism can be assassinated on the order of the president. We can see the whole range of police state measures, such as this universal spying on citizens, their emails, their credit card purchases, the telephone calls, their web surfing, and they are creating dossiers on people's social connections. And all of this is stored in these massive depositories out in the state of Utah. Well, I could go on, and the article does list quite a number of these things. None of this is compatible with democracy or freedom. No one is free who's constantly monitored, and no one is free who can be executed or locked away indefinitely without any evidence presented to a court and without conviction. So this is a police state. This is what the United States is, and it happened very suddenly. It happened during the 21st century, which is now into its 14th year. So it's the work of two presidents, George W. Bush and the current Obama. So that's the real scoop on what the United States is like, and yet it pretends that it's the great representative of democracy, and that because it is this representative, it has the right to invade, bomb, order around other countries, and it consistently demonizes. For example, Saddam Hussein was demonized, and Iraq was destroyed. Gaddafi in Libya was demonized. The country was destroyed. Assad in Syria was demonized, and the people in Washington came within 2 or 3 days of launching a devastating attack that would have destroyed Syria. They routinely killed people in Pakistan and Yemen, Somalia, with drones and missiles and bombs. And all this is done on the basis that that the United States is the indispensable and exceptional country, and therefore it is not bound by any international law or even its own domestic law, and it's not bound by diplomatic convention. And now this sort of arrogance, the superpower hubris, is spread into the demonization of President Putin of Russia. And what we're witnessing is an American orchestrated coup in Ukraine, the imposition of an American stooge government that is not elected, and to keep all attention away from that, Russia and Putin are being demonized, and Washington doesn't listen to what Russia is saying and is driving a situation in a reckless way that could end up in a devastating war.
I'd like to come back to Ukraine and how dangerous it is, but if I can summarize your argument and how you've laid it out in this article, you're talking about how the executive branch has escaped from control which used to function in the United States. This escape from control of the executive branch of the president allows tyranny in the interests and at the direction of a few of the elites whom you listed. And I take it you're pointing in this article to a few levers which make this possible. You write, number one, thanks to the Republican Federalist Society and to the Republican judges the Federalist Society has managed to have appointed to the federal bench, the federal judiciary functions as a protector of executive branch tyranny. Second, you pointed out that the press is no longer free. The United States does not rank very high anymore unless by country of press freedom. And I think you're pointing out that the political system has been neutered by its hyper-reliance on campaign contributions, which is made all the worse by the McCutcheon ruling of the Supreme Court recently. And you also point out, very interestingly, citing an article by Eric Zeus, and others have written, a couple others have written about it, but I think his was the most detailed, about how regulatory agencies are now captured and don't function anymore. That in this case, with this article, the SEC is entirely in the hands of basically the banks it's supposed to be regulating because the employees there want to get lucrative jobs afterward. So have I got you right that this has happened, or at least come to flower after the year 2000, that the judiciary is now in the hands of the executive branch, the press is neutered, the political system is neutered by campaign contributions, and the regulatory agencies are also captured? So in a nutshell, is that basically where we've come?
Right. That's a very good summary of it. You did a much better job explaining it than I did.
I don't know about that. I used your article as a template. If we can go now for a moment to the Ukraine. The idea here, and you're not the first to point it out, but you've done so decisively and insightfully, is the U.S. and the West were behind the Maidan revolution, not orchestrating it in its entirety. But this is an example or an expression of the U.S. or Western interference, hubris-like interference in another country's domestic affairs, destabilizing Ukraine, imposing, or at least certainly strongly encouraging, a new revolutionary regime. And now there's going to be blowback because this regime is really not under control of Washington. And it may also be, I think maybe you haven't said this in the article, but Washington doesn't have control of itself, that it's not really clear to the people in Kiev who are working for Washington what they're supposed to be doing. I don't know who's calling the shots exactly. Can you talk a bit about the Western and especially the U.S. interference in the affairs of Ukraine and whether the U.S. community which undertakes this is unified, is harmonized, is rational?
Well, it's an insane interference because it presents such a dramatic strategic threat to Russia. The Ukraine is really two countries as it is assembled. Crimea was stuck into Ukraine by Khrushchev, and a good bit of eastern and southern Ukraine are former Russian territories that were put there by the Soviet Communist Party, I think primarily Lenin. And all the reasons for this are not completely clear to me. So you've got two populations, Russian-speaking population in the southern and eastern part, and then you've got Ukrainians in the western part. And so this coup that was organized by Washington and the NGOs that it has been financing ever since the Orange Revolution in 2004 failed to deliver the Ukraine to Washington. when the elected president of Ukraine refused to join the EU, Washington called its forces out into action, and we began these protests, which a right-wing element seemed to take over and introduce violence. And so the elected government was deposed, and we have available on the internet the leaked conversation between the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for that region of the world and the American ambassador in Kiev, describing who they would put into the Ukrainian government to replace the one they had just overthrown. So, and lo and behold, that's exactly who was put into the government. So it's not really controversial that this is a government imposed by Washington. Now, why did Washington do this? I think the basic drive, it comes from the neoconservative ideology of American world hegemony. And the countries in the way of American hegemony are Russia, China, and Iran. So Russia sort of got in the way of Washington in Syria. It blocked the planned invasion, and Russia got in the way of the attack on Iran by working out a diplomatic solution. And so I think Washington decided they would bring Russia so many problems that it would be less likely, would have less confidence to continue interfering with the American hegemony over the world. So this is the main thrust. And of course, if you get Ukraine in the EU, you get them into NATO, and you put more missile bases, and Washington had hoped to get the entire Ukraine intact so that Russia could be evicted from its Black Sea naval base. Now, that was the hope, but what Washington overlooked was the Russian population and the Russian-speaking population were very much distressed by the events in Kiev, especially the Russophobic aspects of it, banning the use of Russian language as an official language, the kinds of threats that were being issued toward Russians, and the destruction of the Soviet war memorials celebrating the liberation of Ukraine from the Nazis. And so these parts of Ukraine that are traditional Russian territories began agitating for their own separation and independence. Crimea achieved it, and now this is spread into the eastern and southern Russian areas of Ukraine, and so the whole thing is a mess. And what has happened now is the CIA director has gone to Kiev and apparently given the go-ahead to start talking about using force to put down these protests in these Russian-speaking areas. And Ukraine has now appealed to the UN for a UN force. Now, obviously, all of this is being orchestrated by Washington. Mm-hmm. And Washington has sent warships to the Black Sea and is badgering NATO to build up forces on the Eastern European borders with Russia. And the danger in this is that Washington doesn't listen. The Russian government keeps saying this needs to be resolved diplomatically, keeps making sensible proposals, and Washington keeps demonizing Russia and keeps telling more lies and driving the process to more of a crisis. So what is the agenda? Is this just the inability of Washington to realize they've made a mess of it and they're not willing to acknowledge it and to back off, and so they have to continue pushing it? or do they actually intend to push it to war? Whether they intend to or not, the Russian government can no more accept violence against the Russians in Ukraine than it could accept violence against the Russians in South Ossetia. And so if this program of sending militias or troops or whatever into these Russian-speaking areas armed to do violence to the protesters, it's almost impossible for Russia not to intervene. You couldn't expect the Russian government to be able to maintain its credibility with Russians if it sits there while these Russian territories are savaged or brutalized. And so it's a very serious situation for that reason, and for Washington to refuse to acknowledge that and to continue to drive this process toward a worse crisis, particularly when they're threatening Russia with military buildups. This is extremely dangerous. And so I conclude that the United States has become a major threat to life on Earth, because if there is a war, neither side can afford to lose. And so that makes the risk of nuclear weapons being used extremely high. And why this should come out of some sort of Washington plan to establish a stooge government in Ukraine, I mean, how is that worth the risk that is developing for the rest of the world?
I think you've done a very good job in the article and here in demonstrating that the transformation of the American system that's come to flower after 2000, where the executive branch escapes control, can lead to grave dangers, very irresponsible, aggressive foreign policy with consequences that could be devastating. And I'm not going to ask you for a prediction of how this turns out. I think the insight and the analysis by itself should give us more than enough to think about. And I want to thank you for joining us, Paul Craig Roberts.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And I want to alert readers to the article, "Washington is Humanity's Worst Enemy." You can find it in English and other languages all over the web.